Wim Lavin here, and I'm going to answer the question, how can we understand the causes of war? So I want to offer a couple of different frameworks. I want to try and keep this one a little bit short. Some of our sections this week have been a little bit on the long side. Um, and I just want to give some kind of methodological, analytical frames for thinking about causes of war. Um, so in the first frame, just to go over what they're going to be, in the first frame, I just want to talk about diplomatic failure. That essentially, war means that leaders have failed. And in the second one, I want to offer kind of a bifurcation, if you will, of the greed model versus the grievance model, and how that applies to really understanding or being able to kind of look at both sides, not of the two or multiple warring factions, but the two ways to look at one side, um, to help us to understand again the causes of war, which will ultimately get back to what most of the stuff I talk about is, that interests, values, and needs underlie basically all conflicts, and that we can actually look at problem solving as a much better mechanism, and that war is just hyper competitive coercive force, which is rarely an effective strategy, especially when taken to that extreme. Um, but sometimes it seems to work out well, meeting parties' interests in the short term. So anyway, in the first case, we can look at war as a reflection of leadership failure, quite simply in that, as I've said multiple times, war is exceptionally expensive. The costs of war almost always exceed, the gains from the adventure, if you will. Um, Whatever the interests that are being protected or championed, what people are going for, um, right? If we put a monetary value on it, the cost of the war is more expensive, right? It's a bad return on investment. Now that's not to say that we can put a price tag on everything, right? I want to be clear about that. Um, you know, what is the price? What is the value of a human life? If a military campaign is being employed to prevent, restrict, limit human rights violations and atrocities, we can say, that there's a benefit, and we might have a hard time saying, like, what is actually the value, and being able to have a boots in the ground intervention. The argument that I would make there for kind of being a pro nonviolence, pro peace approach is the part where routinely our military leaders, General Petraeus is the person I quote most frequently, because year after year he would go to Congress and say, "You guys keep on funding all of our combat operations, but year after year I keep telling you, stop, give us the money for our non-combat operations." Our non-combat operations are more cost-effective, both in terms of finances and human life. Right? This is because the kind of intelligence that they would get out of building bridges, literally sometimes building bridges, was better than what they could achieve through force. Um, Again, good intelligence being exceptionally valuable and stuff. But anyway, getting back to the part where there's leadership failure. Um, the idea that we have parties coming right together, having these coalitions because they're in a struggle for getting their needs met, and the idea that in the challenge of trying to maintain force or power in order to get needs met, if we're using violence, that means that either we don't know how to go about it a different way. And again, conflict avoidance, accommodation, compromise, and collaboration are all other steps that we could attempt to employ, um, without taking a competition to its coercive and violent extreme. Um, if we have the engagement of physical violence, which we know is not cost effective, then that means that given the whole literal arsenal of intellectual opportunities to be strategic in problem solving, that we have not been able to bring the other party to get the table and figure out a way to work through our tensions, right? And the truth is, we can't always get somebody else to do what we want. I mean, I'll admit it, we can't. Like, if I were to go to class and say, you know, in the next 10 lessons, I'll be able to teach you how to always get what you want in conflict, you could rightly complain that I was committing fraud, because there's no way whatsoever to make promises about how other people, other countries will behave. But there are strategies, and the strategies of like building trust by making and keeping agreements, being able to work towards common goals and overarching objectives, should be ultimately quite easy, even if it's slow, given that the alternative is so expensive. Which begs the question of, what do we fight for? And what's the urgency, right? If the idea is that we don't have time to go about something, slowly, then what are we fighting over, right? And the things that would be direct indications of we're fighting because our needs here are life and death, right? And that could be access to resources, right? Water supplies, right? People fight over water more and more because population and water pollution and so forth is making that a much more costly asset, or much more serious liability. And people will die if they don't have water. And food sources, again, can be the same way. And so we know how this kind of plays out on an individual level, but how does that work for a group or state level context? Again, the leadership failure that I guess I'm getting to is that if you can't anticipate that there is this issue and find the means to reach out to it, to get that need addressed, you might be to blame, but simultaneously we have an international system. So like when we look to parts of the world where, again, the poor are being most heavily impacted by things like climate change, and areas where they had been, historically able to farm are drying up and turning into deserts and so forth. So leadership then is maybe not even party to the dispute, but leadership is to blame because we do have a global economy. We do have international systems that are supposed to be living up to, right? The United Nations has a bunch of things that they've agreed upon as basic human rights. And leadership is then failing to deliver on those ends. So the fact that war is happening on our planet means that our planet as a whole, right, as an international system, has failed to live up to its mandate, right? League of Nations forms after World War I. Their sole motivation was to make sure this never happens again. World War II takes place. Clearly, the League of Nations failed. World War II sees states coming together to put an end to the war and forms the United Nations to try to become what the League of Nations had failed to do. Now, I'll argue with people all the time, right? Because that's what jerks like me do. Um, but both sides have points. The United Nations have failed time and time and time again. Human rights violations have taken place under their watch. Security Council would meet month after month after month to fail to respond to 5,000 civilian casualties in Syria month after month, right? 5,000 people a month are being slaughtered and killed. And the United Nations is not able to get in there and do something. Genocides, horrible things that are happening. But the goals, the aims of the United Nations, I actually do think are noble, and I'm glad that there is an organization that's in place with the hope of delivering peace. So if we have war, the United Nations have failed. If we have war, the United States of America have failed, right? And that's not because I believe that they're the global police. It's just because they're a big part of what the United Nations does or does not do. The same as Russia and the other members of the Security Council, right? Leadership fails. War is proof that leadership has failed to identify the causes of conflict, that leadership has failed to come up with ways to make proper de-escalation, to deliver on food and other vital resources, water, the causes of war. Human necessities. Right? Our system causes war when we predictably, right? And I mean the global we, when we predictably fail to deliver life-sustaining needs. So the greed and the grievance here, right? So many times when we look to conflicts, especially like global war or small-scale conflicts, kind of works the same way. But when we see the groups of people, right, the invaders will be seen by those who are defending their land as being greedy, right? They're here to pillage us. They want more, right? They're not controlling their appetite, their thirst for more. And that's a general tendency. And we can examine things from what is the quest for power or to plunder, and to examine what part of human nature or instinct or whatever helps us to look at these behaviors, hoarding, so forth. That people are out to take care of themselves, to get more for themselves, and to disregard others in their process. On the other side of that, however, we have what's called the grievance model, which is to say that it's kind of like a different version of hurting people hurt people. It's to say that those who have been victimized will then use violence to try to achieve justice or to engage with the life-sustaining resources or to get some sort of equity. When somebody steals from you and nobody there, there's no system to create justice for you, that then you'll have to extract that kind of restitution yourself. So in the first part, the greed, it wouldn't even be revenge, right? I'm just out for self-gain. And the grievance part of the equation, you're not looking at it like it's revenge, but more like it's restitution or reparations, right? We take from others because stuff has been taken from us. So, we have a number of different ways to look at it. Again, I wanted to frame this so that we could see that the violence is just a strategy that gets employed for parties to defend or pursue their fundamental interests, values, and needs, and that we can look at this as being reflective of whether or not leadership has failed to protect and to provide for those interests, values, and needs, or whether or not leadership has failed, right? We know that there are things that are predictable, and we know that there are things that literally people will fight for. We tend to see that come out, again, with basic human rights. We see that come out with protecting moral or spiritual symbolism, faith, right? The things that are important for people, right? Self, family, nation, and God. And so that's what people fight over, historically and in the contemporary world. If people aren't getting their needs met, they will act, especially when it's important to them, in order to try to fulfill those wants. Catch you all in the next one.